Tributes are pouring in for 11-time NBA champion and civil rights activist Bill Russell. He died Sunday at the age of 88.
And Russell broke barriers as both a player and as the NBA's first black head coach. He also marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Washington and stood by Muhammad Ali when he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. CBS Morning's co-anchor Nate Burleson sat down with Russell last year and spoke with him about his legacy.
You got to understand something. My motivation was to make myself acceptable to my folks. I never felt like I was making a contribution. I was just doing the best I could.
Russell's family says he died peacefully with his wife at his side.
CBS News special correspondent and host of the NFL Today, James Brown, joins us now. JB, thank you so much for being here. Let's get to it. Tell us about the difficulties that Bill Russell faced when he got started on the Boston Celtics and later on as a head coach.
You know what? I don't think Bill Russell really gave us the full extent of how difficult and challenging it was for him playing in Boston, but it only speaks volumes about the focus and his ability to, as much as was humanly possible, to block out the poor reception that he received there. And despite how excellent he was on the court and leading the team to victory, as a matter of fact, he shared one time he had a phenomenal game, some 22 points and about 25 rebounds. But the headlines the next day talked about how Bob Cousy, the other team's star, had been so instrumental in that victory. May seem to be small in the minds of many, but that on top of all that he was going through in terms of having his home vandalized and people in uproar that he was with the team, et cetera, it made it very difficult. My hat's off to him in a major way for how he blocked all of that out as best as possible to have the stellar career that he did.
And JB, you make that point. That is no small feat. I mean, in the clip that we just played, he says, I simply did the best that I could, showing incredible humility. But in the age now, let's say, of Colin Kaepernick, where so many athletes are reluctant to speak out on social issues for fear of social backlash that Bill Russell himself experienced, give us some insight into how he dealt with these decisions. I mean, at one point he went to the home of Medgar Evers, a civil rights icon, after he was killed to show solidarity. Why did he choose to be vocal about racism and segregation and all the things that were really ripping the country apart then and still exist now?
Hey, Errol, and I'm sure you and Deborah have covered enough stories, and particularly for those who've gone through it, be it a woman in circumstances where a woman isn't being treated fairly, or those of color. How unbelievable that people would ask, well, why would you speak out? Because an injustice is an injustice. But yet again, as I was speaking about the stellar accomplishments that he had in light of all of that, but that was the case with Jackie Robinson being the one who broke the color barrier in baseball, whether it was Joe Louis in boxing, Jackie Robinson, of course, in baseball. It is a phenomenal amount of pressure that guys have been up under, and it does cause one to scratch their head when you think about athletes today who are operating on the shoulders of what those who were the first or one of the few going through that they ought to be very appreciative of. Thankfully, we are seeing athletes across the sports spectrum, even from sports like hockey, and certainly the women with the WNBA, all speaking up more vocally about these things and seeking an ecumenical and inclusive approach to dealing with things that are just not right, so as to make it better for all involved.
JB, what will you remember most about him?
Wow. You know what, there's been, from a sports perspective, so many people were talking about, it's interesting how they call him perhaps the greatest winner of any sport ever. Some will talk about the greatest defensive player. Look, in the world of sports, when people argue about who the best is, I'm a proponent of believing what Red Auerbach, his awesome coach, said, that a great player in any era could be a great player in any era because they were that distinctly different and gifted. So it's hard to talk about somebody who's the greatest of all time. We ought to talk about in that given era. But make no mistake about it, if people were to hazard a guess to talk about the greatest basketball player ever, because people always talk about how many championships did they win, Did they make their teammates better? It's a resounding yes in the case of Bill Russell. So if you want to go there, he was, in fact, the greatest basketball player ever, because when you look at the championships, 11, no one comes close to that.
Speaking of the greatest of all time, that's JB. We really appreciate
No
you,
doubt.
James Brown. Thank you.
Thanks, JB.